What is the Kalam Cosmological argument? Let's allow one of its greatest medieval champions to speak for himself. Al-Ghazali was a 12th century Muslim theologian from Persia, or modern-day Iran. He was concerned that Muslim philosophers of his day were being influenced by ancient Greek philosophy to deny God's creation of the universe. They held that the universe flows necessarily out of God and is therefore beginningless. After thoroughly studying the teachings of these philosophers, Al-Ghazali wrote a withering critique of their views entitled The Incoherence of the Philosophers. In this fascinating book, he argues that the idea of a beginningless universe is absurd. The universe must have a beginning, and since nothing begins to exist without a cause, there must be a transcendent creator of the universe. Al-Ghazali frames his argument very simply, I quote, "Every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning." So, once again, we can summarize Al-Ghazali's argument in three simple, easily memorizable steps. 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. This argument is so marvelously simple that it's easy to memorize and share with another person. It's also a logically airtight argument. If the two premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. So anybody who wants to deny the conclusion has to regard either premise 1 or premise 2 as false. So the whole question is it more probable that these statements are true or that they are false? Let's examine each premise in turn. Dennett agrees that the universe has a cause, but he thinks that the cause of the universe is itself. Yes, he's serious. He thinks that in the ultimate bootstrapping trick, those are his words, the universe created itself. Now, somebody needs to say that the emperor is wearing no clothes. Dennett's view is patent nonsense. Notice, he's not saying that the universe is self-caused in the sense that it is eternal and beginningless. No. He's saying that at some point in the finite past, the universe brought itself into existence. But this is clearly impossible, for in order to create itself, the universe would have to already exist. It would have to exist before it existed, which is a self-contradiction. So that Dennett's view is patent nonsense. It is logically incoherent.
None of the physical Big Bang theories out there, none of them have the physicists start by saying, God did it, then the Big Bang. That's why they're investigating it. And it cannot be scientific to include God did this or God before that, because it defies the principle of falsifiability, which is the cornerstone of our science. We cannot fill the gaps Yep, there is a question. So how do you explain basically the technique of filling the gaps of what we know right now with simply God did it when there's no way of testing it?
Yeah. This is a wonderful question. Can we have the slide on the cosmological argument up again? Notice that I am not proposing God as a sort of theoretical entity in a scientific theory. So you are quite right in saying that scientists don't include God as part of their cosmology, but neither am I. All I'm using the scientific evidence for is empirical support for that second premise, the universe began to exist, which is a religiously neutral statement that can be found in any textbook on astronomy and astrophysics. The theological implications only emerge in the context of a philosophical argument that isn't a scientific argument. This isn't an exercise in metaphysics, literally beyond physics. So I'm not using God of the gaps reasoning. I'm not using God as a scientific entity. I'm not doing theistic science. I'm simply saying that the best current science we have makes premise 2 more plausible than not. And the religious significance of this only emerges in the context of this broader philosophical argument. Such a transcendent cause must possess a number of striking properties. As the cause of space and time, this cause must transcend space and time, and therefore exist non-temporally and non-spatially, at least without the universe. This cause must therefore be changeless and immaterial, since something can be timeless only if it is unchanging, and something can be unchanging only if it is immaterial. It must also be unimaginably powerful, since it created all matter and energy, space and time. Finally, and most remarkably, such a transcendent cause must be personal. 2 reasons can be given for this conclusion. First, the only entities we know of which can be timeless and immaterial are either minds or abstract objects like numbers. But abstract objects don't stand in causal relations. Therefore, the transcendent cause of the origin of the universe must be an unembodied mind. Secondly, only a free agent can account for the origin of a temporal effect from a timeless cause. If the cause of the universe were an impersonal, mechanically operating cause, then the cause could never exist without its effect. For if the sufficient condition of the effect is given, then the effect must be given as well. The only way for the cause to be timeless, but for its effect to begin in time, is for the cause to be a personal agent who freely chooses to create an effect in time without any antecedent determining conditions. And thus we are brought not merely to a transcendent cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Therefore, from the cosmological argument alone, we may conclude that a personal creator of the universe exists, who is uncaused, beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and unimaginably powerful.
This is a sophisticated question, Dr. Craig, on the Kalam. He says, Dear Dr. Craig, I've been a long-time defender of the Kalam cosmological argument, but recently encountered an objection to the KCA for which I do not have a fully satisfying answer. Here we go. If the Kalam succeeds in proving the universe has a cause, it follows by logical inference that the cause must be immaterial, timeless, and spaceless, since matter, time, and space came into being with the universe. Immateriality, non-spatiality, and timelessness are negative descriptions that describe the absence of some positive reality, not the presence of a positive reality, similar to darkness, the absence of light, and cold, the absence of heat. They describe what is not what is. Why then should we attribute these descriptions to the cause of the universe as if they were properties had by that cause and describing the nature of that cause?
Okay, Kevin, let's stop right there. I want to interrupt at this point because I think that we can answer that question directly. If the argument is successful in proving that there is a cause of the universe, then these negative properties are descriptive of the cause of the universe. For there to be a cause of the universe is a positive assertion about the existence of something, and therefore completely different from nothingness. It is to assert the positive existence of a being which is causally related to the universe. And to discover that this being is therefore spaceless, timeless, and immaterial is to give a positive description of the nature of this being. Even if those properties are not positive qualities, it's very informative to learn that this is a being, for example, which never changes or doesn't change. And indeed, it would ask or occasion the question, is this being not simply changeless, but is it immutable? Is it unchangeable, which would be a modal property, so that a deeper question might arise. Similarly, if we find out this being is timeless, that would occasion the question, well, is it necessarily timeless, or could it become temporal if it so chose? Could it enter time? Is it necessarily spaceless, or could it enter space? So these are questions which arise and are interesting metaphysical questions as a result of these very descriptive properties of the nature of this real, existent cause of the universe. So it's simply incorrect to think that because it has these negative properties, or that these negative descriptions hold of it, that these are not informative about the nature of this transcendent cause. On the contrary, they're extremely informative properties.
Well, I've often heard it said, Bill, that in order to get a healthy definition, you have to assert the positive as often as you can. But you're saying that sometimes part of the defining process is by looking at what something is not or does not
Sure, of course. For example, if I were to tell you that Joe is penniless, that would be a very important thing to know about Joe.
No, you'd be talking about me. No. Yeah, that would be.
But nevertheless, that would be really an important thing to know. Or if you were to tell someone, potential recruit for the football team, that he's talentless, again, that would be an important thing for the recruiter to know. So negative descriptions which are true, which actually hold of a thing, can be very important, and as I suggested, metaphysically significant, because they can raise further metaphysical questions that are very deep. How can a timeless reality be related to a temporal effect? Is it necessarily timeless or only contingently so? So these are very important properties for a thing to have, or very important descriptions to hold of a thing.
Are you saying that when we do a conceptual analysis of what this being would be like, and that it couldn't have this, and this, that opens up analysis of that could include positive things, and negative things?
Of course, and it does include positive things. For example, its causal power. One of the positive properties of this cause must be that it's enormously powerful, if not omnipotent, because it has brought the space-time material universe into existence without any sort of material cause. So that would be a very positive characterization. And moreover, here again, we see the cash value of these negative properties on the basis of its causal power and its timelessness and immateriality. I argue for its personhood, which is certainly a positive property. The argument for the personhood of the Creator is based precisely on the facts of its immateriality, timelessness, and causal efficacy. So these negative properties can be enormously significant metaphysically.
That reminds me of a question that we got. It said, Dr. Craig, my professor said that the Kalam cosmological argument in itself does not get you to a personal God. Well, he's right in a sense. I mean, but by itself,
yes,
it opens up further analysis, right?
Right. It gets you to a cause of the universe. And then I would argue that when you do a conceptual analysis of what properties a cause of the universe must have, given the premises of the argument, you see that such a being must be an uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, changeless, powerful, personal creator, so that you do get to a theistic concept as a result of this conceptual analysis. Now, what I would argue is that there are arguments for the existence of God based on things like the origin of the universe, which show that, in fact, the creator and designer of the universe cannot be a flying spaghetti monster. One reason, very simply, is a flying spaghetti monster is a physical object. It is a material object extended in space and time, and therefore it cannot be the cause of the Big Bang, because the cause of the Big Bang has to exist beyond space and time and be the creator of all matter and energy in the universe, which come into existence at the initial cosmological singularity. So the cause of the universe has to be an immaterial, timeless, spaceless being which transcends the universe and brings it into existence. And therefore the flying spaghetti monster hypothesis is simply inept as an explanation of the origin of the universe, not to speak of the fine-tuning of the laws of nature to which this flying spaghetti monster would himself be subject. So the parody is a silly one, and it does really nothing to undercut the standard arguments for a transcendent creator and designer of the universe, which enable us to deduce several of the properties of this being, which are theologically significant and consonant with the classical concept of God. I was simply saying that this is not a mere matter of speculation, that there's more than a tiny bit of evidence on the table.
But is he saying
evidence for what?
Evidence for a beginning of the universe.
Yes.
Well, we know that. Nobody just...
All right, well, that's what I'm offering in this first argument, is the evidence.
But
why?
because there's a
Because nobody
beginning
disputes
doesn't
it.
imply a God.
It does if the first premise is true, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. It logically follows
Yeah,
that
but it
therefore...
doesn't. But the cause hasn't got to be God.
Well, remember I gave an argument for thinking that this cause is timeless,
Yes, I know.
spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, and personal.
I think it's a computer.
Well, that wouldn't... computers are designed by people.
No, this is a self-designing computer.
Timeless.
Timeless.
Well, that's a contradiction in terms.
Why is it time? What's contradictory about it?
A computer has to function. It takes
Oh no,
time.
this is a special computer.
Yeah, but it has to be logically coherent.
Oh, it's logically coherent.
Yes, you have to be
Oh
logically
no,
coherent.
this
And
computer
besides-
is amazing.
No, besides, it would have to be, as I said, a personal being.
No.
And a computer is a physical...
Not this computer.
object.
Oh
Well, then,
no.
Okay, see, what you're doing is what you're calling a computer is really God. A non-physical, It's just another word if you rob it of all the attributes that make it a computer.
You brought up a very strong argument about why there isn't an all-powerful being, but how would you know which of the millions that were created throughout history is the one that is correct? How can you know that is the biblical God?
The first several arguments that I gave, the cosmological, the teleological, the contingency argument, the ontological argument, are consistent with any sort of monotheistic view of the world. So my Jewish and Muslim friends would resonate with those arguments and would agree with me on those arguments. It's when you get to the resurrection of Jesus that my case now narrows for a biblical theism and for why I think that the God revealed by Jesus exists. So that's where the case begins to narrow. The reason I'm a Christian theist rather than, say, a Jewish theist or a Muslim theist is because of Jesus, what he claimed, what he taught, and his resurrection from the dead. I think that vindicates his claim to be the absolute revelation of God. I've already told you how Daniel Dennett responds to this argument. Would you like to hear how Richard Dawkins responds? Like Dennett, Dawkins doesn't deny either premise of the argument. Instead, he merely questions the theological significance of the argument's conclusion. He writes, even if we allow the dubious luxury of arbitrarily conjuring up a terminator to an infinite regress and giving it a name, there is absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God: omnipotence, omniscience, goodness, creativity of design, to say nothing of such human attributes as listening to prayers, forgiving sins, and reading innermost thoughts. Now, notice that Dawkins doesn't dispute that the argument proves the existence of a beginningless, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, changeless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe. He merely complains that this creator hasn't also been shown to be omnipotent, omniscient, creative of design, listening to prayers, forgiving sins, and reading innermost thoughts. To which I say, so what? The argument doesn't aspire to prove such things. It would be a bizarre form of atheism, indeed one not worth the name, that believed that there exists a beginningless, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, changeless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe, who may also, for all we know, possess the properties listed by Dawkins. If Al-Ghazali's argument is right, then Dawkins' atheism is philosophically bankrupt.
And I want to read this one letter that we got. It says, Dear Dr. Craig, while an atheist, I do admire the intellectual rigor which you apply to your beliefs. It is refreshing to see someone defend their faith with such intelligence. My question is concerning whether the Kalam commits the fallacy of composition. That is, assuming something whole has the same properties as its parts. For example, the alphabet is made up of letters, but is not itself a letter. So, Bill, why don't you discuss the fallacy of composition first?
The fallacy of composition, as he says, is reasoning that because all of the parts of something have a certain property, therefore the whole has that property. For example, if every little piece of an elephant is light in weight, then the whole elephant is light in weight. That would be committing the fallacy of composition. It's not true that because every part has a property, that the whole thing composed of those parts has the property. And I think, Kevin, the allegation here is supposed to be against the premise that says everything that begins to exist has a cause. And the reader apparently is under the impression that one justifies seeking a cause of the universe by arguing compositionally, that because everything in the universe has a cause, therefore the universe as a whole has a cause. And that's just manifestly incorrect. That is the fallacy of composition. But if you read my work, I think you'll find nowhere in anything that I've ever written or published or said have I defended the causal principle or there being a cause of the universe by composition. That would be obviously fallacious. Rather, what I argue is that the principle, everything that begins to exist, everything that comes into being at some point, must have a cause which brings it into existence. And this is rooted in the metaphysical truth that something can't come out of nothing. And moreover, I think that this principle is constantly confirmed in our experience. So I wouldn't think to try to justify the Kalam cosmological argument's conclusion by arguing from composition. That would just be wrong, but he's setting up a straw man here, which no one has defended.
What if I were to say that all the tiles on the floor are brown, therefore the floor is brown?
Yes, what that illustrates is that sometimes the whole does possess the property of its parts, and if every piece of the floor is brown, then the whole floor is brown. That seems obviously true. So sometimes the whole will have the property of its parts, other times it won't, and therefore you can't just automatically assume that because every piece or part of a whole has a property, therefore the whole has it. It may indeed have it, but you can't reason that just because the part has it, therefore the whole has it. You would have to give some sort of justification for thinking that the whole would have the property that its parts do.
If the infinite, you said the infinite doesn't exist apart from the mind, but if the infinite doesn't exist apart from the mind, how can God be infinite apart from the mind? Is it not highly possible for God to exist only in our minds?
Right, very good question. Don't Christians or theists think that God is infinite? And if an actual infinite cannot exist, then how can God exist? It's important to understand that infinity, when it's applied to God, isn't a mathematical concept. It's not a quantitative concept. When I'm speaking of an actual infinite, I'm talking about a set that has an infinite number of definite and discrete finite particulars, like the set of natural numbers, or the set of guests in a hotel, or a set of marbles or baseball cards. But when people talk about the infinity of God, this isn't a quantitative concept. God isn't a set composed of an infinite number of definite and discrete finite parts. Rather, it's a qualitative notion when one speaks of God's infinity. It just means things like God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, eternal, necessary, all-present, and all of those superlative attributes. Infinity is, in a sense, just the umbrella term for all of those superlative attributes, and none of those are quantitative in nature. Those are qualitative. So I don't think that my argument against the existence of an actually infinite number of things has any bearing on this concept of the infinity of God.
This questioner says, "Hello, Dr. Craig. My professor has presented these two refutations of the Kalam cosmological argument. Number one, he says that it begs the question. The first reason the Kalam argument is invalid and refuted is that it creates the logical fallacy of begging the question. This is because the phrase, whatever begins to exist, is not presumed to accommodate anything other than God, and that puts God into the definition of the premise of the argument that is supposed to prove his existence in the first place." Did you get that?
No, that is very strange. I'm troubled that a professor would say something that incoherent. What I have heard, Kevin, is people on the internet say is that the premise, everything that begins to exist has a cause, begs the question, because it assumes that the universe has a cause. And that's supposed to be the conclusion of the argument. Now, what these folks have failed to understand is the difference between begging the question and a deductive argument. A deductive argument, by its very nature, is simply an unpacking of what is already implicit in the premises. But that doesn't mean that it's question begging. For example, if I say, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, I'm not begging the question in asserting the first premise. That's just the nature of a deductive argument, that the premise is implicit, that the conclusion is implicit in the premises and is derived from it then by logical rules of inference. Begging the question means that your only reason for adopting a premise is that you already believe the conclusion. That's what it means to reason in a circle or beg the question. And that's not why, for example, you would believe all men are mortal. That would be based upon medical evidence and biological evidence about the human body and so forth. It's not begging the question. Similarly, the argument for everything beginning to exist having a cause would be based upon this metaphysical position that something cannot come out of nothing, that things don't just pop into being without having causes. So it's not because you believe the conclusion that you believe the premise. It's not begging the question in that circular way. Rather, it's simply the nature of a deductive argument that the conclusion is implicit in the premises and needs to be made explicit by the logical rules of inference.
The Kalam cosmological argument fails because it changes the meaning of begins to exist midstream and hides it in the language. Well, quite a mouthful there.
Yeah, he thinks that both the premises are false and that the argument commits a fallacy of equivocation. So it's a pretty bad argument, according to him. Now, does it commit an equivocation in the word begins to exist? Well, not at all. We can give content to the notion of beginning to exist. We can say that X begins to exist at T, sometime T, if and only if X exists at T, and there is no time prior to T at which X exists. I'll repeat that. X begins to exist at T, if and only if X exists at T, and there's no time prior to T at which X exists. That defines a univocal sense of begins to exist, which works in that argument and would show that there's simply no fallacy of equivocation going on. So I think his refutation is really quite without merit.
Let me ask you to respond, if you might. This notion that the components of the universe have always existed, all signs point to the universe always existing, and therefore we don't need a God.
Yeah. What's funny about this objection is that this is not an objection to the existence of God. This would be an objection to the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe. It would show that the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe is false because according to that theory, all matter and energy, even space and time themselves, came into being at the moment of the Big Bang and are therefore not eternal. They haven't always been there in the past. So if these fellows were right, all contemporary cosmologists who believe in the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe would be contradicting the laws of thermodynamics, and that's hardly the case. Why? Well, because the laws of thermodynamics, in particular the law of the conservation of matter and energy, only applies once the universe comes into being, it applies at every moment, at every time, and every point in the universe. But it doesn't apply to the origin of the universe itself. And that's why cosmologists don't consider that the law of conservation of energy and mass is violated by the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe. The law holds at every moment in the universe, but it doesn't say that the universe itself, all matter and energy, can't have an original beginning point at some point in the finite past. In fact, the atheist fellow mentioned the laws of thermodynamics. He might have wanted to talk about the second law of thermodynamics, which says that in a closed system, things tend toward increasing disorder. Now, the universe on the atheistic view is just a gigantic closed system because it is everything there is and there's nothing outside it. And what that implies is that given sufficient time, everything in the universe would grind down to a state of maximum disorder. So if the universe has existed for infinite time from eternity past, why is it that we don't find ourselves in this sort of thermodynamically disordered state? I think that the best answer to that is that the universe has not existed forever. It began a finite time ago in a low entropy condition, and the thermodynamic clock has been running ever since then. So the evidence of thermodynamics itself suggests that the universe and matter and energy are not infinite or eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning.
Dear Dr. Craig, one of the objections which has been raised to the Kalam cosmological argument that is out there on the internet is the first law of thermodynamics, the rule that matter and energy can only be rearranged, or in other words, that matter is neither being created nor destroyed.
Right.
That disproves the first premise of the Kalam.
That whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's
I've heard
bizarre.
this before.
I mean, how would that possibly disprove the premise that everything that begins to exist, in fact, that would be right in line with the first law of thermodynamics, the conservation of energy and mass?
Because the definition gets misconstrued of the first law of thermodynamics that matter cannot be created nor destroyed. In other words, it's eternal. Matter's eternal because it's neither being created nor destroyed.
I think that what he means to say is that it's inconsistent with the second premise, that the universe began to exist.
Okay.
Because somebody who affirms the eternality of matter and energy would agree that everything that begins to exist has a cause. There's an infinite regress of causes and effects, right?
Right.
In line with the first law. So what?
It'd be the second
I think
premise
he's misstated it. Yes, it would be the second premise that would ostensibly be called into question by the first law, which is the conservation of energy and mass. And we better hope that this law is not incompatible with the truth of the second premise, that the universe began to exist, because if that were the case, Kevin, it would mean that the first law of thermodynamics is in conflict with Big Bang cosmology, which affirms the beginning of the universe, time and space, matter and energy. Now, why don't cosmologists regard the first law as violated by the standard Big Bang theory? The reason is because the first law of thermodynamics is a law of nature and therefore is a physical law that only applies within the arena of space-time. But it doesn't apply to the origin of the arena itself. The first law of thermodynamics doesn't govern before the beginning of the universe or the causal conditions that would bring the universe into being or apply outside the arena. It only applies once the arena is in place and exists, and then within that arena, energy and mass are conserved. And that's why cosmologists who affirm the standard Big Bang model aren't troubled by the fact of an initial beginning and origin of the universe at which all matter and energy come into being and then are conserved from that point on.
Once again, it's a matter of definition here. The first law would only apply to the matter and energy that is.
Yes.
That is here. But it's misconstrued to say, since matter and energy is neither being created nor destroyed, it must be eternal.
That's the inference, but that's a faulty inference.
That's a faulty inference because of all the reasons you just gave us.
The point here to make, Kevin, I think, is that this is not a religious or theological point we're making here. This is a religiously neutral question that faces any secular cosmologist who thinks that the universe had an absolute beginning. He needs to answer this question, well, wait a minute, doesn't this violate the first law? And the answer is no, for the reason that we just gave. So this isn't a theological special pleading of any sort. This is the standard approach of contemporary cosmology to this question.
Well, your refutation to this laughable objection, which the writer says, has seemed to have hit a nerve in the atheist community on the internet sites that I haunt, as they have tried to defend this objection by saying you created a straw man and equivocated your position. They say using "I began to exist" is misleading, because "I" is a misleading use of philosophy since it addresses a form of matter in a particular way, which merely rearranges.
Mm-hmm.
It has also been proposed you equivocated the beginning of the universe with the rearrangements of matter and energy.
Slightly different objection, I suppose it's related, and that is the objector here seems to think that because things that begin to exist have material causes that pre-exist them, that therefore nothing begins to exist. And I point out that that is absurd. It confuses a thing with the matter or the stuff of which the thing is made. And even if the matter of which a thing is made, which constitutes it, pre-exists, that doesn't imply that the thing itself, therefore, is eternal and doesn't begin to exist. And the example I gave was myself. I have not always existed. If you think that because the matter of my body has always been around, that therefore I have always been around, then I want to know, where was I during the Jurassic Age? What was I doing at that time? Did I actually exist prior to my conception? This is clearly absurd. It would be crazy to think that I existed from eternity prior to my conception, even if the stuff of which my body is made has always been around. Now, I take it that the answer that is being proposed here by those on the internet is to say that I'm equivocating here because I am just matter arranged in a particular way and it rearranges. Now, this is very interesting, Kevin. I think that what's happening here is the objector is jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. What he is now saying is that there really is no such entity as I, that in fact what I call myself is just an arrangement it's just particles arranged in a certain way, and those particles have always existed and been arranged in different ways, and now they're arranged as Bill Craig. So what this view is called is actually, there's a name for this view in philosophy. It's called Mereological nihilism. Mereological nihilism. This is the view that there really are no composite objects, that there really are no such things as chairs and tables and people. Rather, they're just particles of matter arranged chair-wise or table-wise or people-wise. In other words, what this view implies is the radical view that I do not exist. The reason that I never began to exist on this view is because I don't exist at all. I don't exist now. And I would submit that that is even more implausible than the previous position that they held, that there are no such things as people, and in fact, there is no such thing as myself. On this view, there's no such thing as dinosaurs, no such thing as planets, no such thing as people, and there is no such thing as myself. I do not exist on this view, which to me, I think, is just crazy.
Yeah.
And it certainly is crazier than thinking that there is a distinction between an object and the stuff of which the object is made. It is far more plausible to think that I exist even though the material particles making up my body existed prior to my existence. So, right, you can avoid the absurdity of saying that I existed prior to my conception by denying that I ever exist, including that I exist now. You can do that if you want, but I think that you've only made matters more implausible and affirmed a philosophical view that is so radical and implausible that it will not commend itself, I think, to very many. Now, as for the universe, the question then would arise, well, why think that the universe then is not just a particular rearrangement of matter and energy? Well, that's a very fair question, and that's addressed in contemporary cosmology. In contemporary cosmology, that is the question that's asked. Is matter and energy eternal in the past? Has it always been there? Or did it come into being? And the model that has dominated the 20th century since the 20s is that matter and energy are not thought to be eternal, as was previously believed, but that matter and energy, all matter and energy, physical space and time themselves came into being at the moment of the Big Bang. Now, this may have been at a singularity, or it may have been a non-singular beginning, as in the Hartle-Hawking no-boundary proposal. But there isn't any contemporary model in astrophysics that enables you to extend the material universe into the infinite past. There's no successful model that does that. So, sure, these folks can raise the question quite legitimately, and the answer in contemporary cosmology has been pretty decidedly that the universe is not simply a rearrangement of eternally existing matter and energy, but rather that all matter and energy in physical space and time themselves had a beginning.
You mentioned mereological nihilism. What is mereology? What is that a study of?
Mereology is the study of wholes and parts, how things are composed of parts. And believe it or not, there's a whole metaphysical field of study that is devoted to the study of wholes and parts. And what this view suggests is that there are no objects composed of parts. There are no composite objects. And so there are just particles, simples, just particles, and these are arranged in different ways, but there really are no such things as dinosaurs or horses or people or chairs. These things don't really exist.
Wow, who thought that up?
Suppose that something could come into existence from nothing. If that were the case, then it's inexplicable why just anything and everything doesn't pop into being out of nothing. But no one here tonight is worried that while you're listening to this debate, a horse may have popped into being uncaused out of nothing in your living room and is there defiling the carpet right now as we speak. As Dr. Slezak himself has written in another context, only academics could be so ridiculous. If made seriously outside the seminar room, such claims would be evidence of clinical derangement. Virtual particles do not come into being uncaused out of nothing. Virtual particles appear in the quantum vacuum, which is a sea of fluctuating energy. It is a rich physical reality endowed with a structure and governed by physical laws. So that when popular magazines and articles portray things coming into being in the vacuum as uncaused out of nothing, they're using the word nothing in a philosophically naive and misleading sense. So for that reason, I think the universe has to have a cause, because out of nothing, nothing comes. In magic, when the magician pulls a rabbit out of the hat, at least you've got the magician and you've got the hat. But on this suggestion, the universe just pops into being out of nothing. It's to quit doing serious metaphysics and to appeal to magic. And so for that reason, I think it takes much, much more faith to think that the universe could pop into being uncaused out of nothing than to think that there's a transcendent personal creator of the universe. Now, it was realized that a physical description of the universe prior to the Planck time, that is 10 to the negative 43 second after the Big Bang singularity, would require the introduction of quantum physics in addition to general relativity. On the quantum level, so-called virtual particles are thought to arise due to fluctuations in the energy locked up in the vacuum. Particles which the Heisenberg indeterminacy principle allows to exist for a fleeting moment before dissolving back into the vacuum. In 1973, Edward Tryon speculated whether the universe might not be a long-lived virtual particle whose total energy is zero, born out of the primordial vacuum. This seemingly bizarre speculation gave rise to a new generation of cosmogonic theories, which we may call vacuum fluctuation models. These models were closely related to an adjustment to the standard model known as inflation. In an attempt to explain or explain away, depending on one's viewpoint, the astonishing large-scale homogeneity and isotropy of the universe, certain theorists proposed that between 10 to the negative 35 and 10 to the negative 33 second after the Big Bang singularity, the universe underwent a phase of super rapid or inflationary expansion, which served to push the inhomogeneities out beyond our event horizon. Prior to the inflationary era, the universe was merely empty space, or a vacuum. And the material universe was born when the vacuum energy was converted into matter via a quantum mechanical phase transition. Now, in most inflationary models, as one extrapolates backward in time, beyond the Planck time, the universe continues to shrink down toward the initial singularity. But in vacuum fluctuation models, it is hypothesized that prior to inflation, the universe as a whole was not, in fact, expanding. Rather, the universe as a whole is a primordial vacuum which exists eternally in a steady state. And throughout this vacuum, subatomic fluctuations occur by means of which matter is created and many universes are born. Our expanding universe is just one of these many universes, an indefinite number of which are conceived in the womb of this greater mother universe as a whole. And thus the beginning of our universe does not represent an absolute beginning, but merely a change in the eternal, uncaused universe as a whole. Though still bandied about in the popular press, vacuum fluctuation models did not outlive the decade of the 1980s. Not only were there theoretical problems with the production mechanisms of matter, but these models faced a deep internal incoherence. According to such models, it is impossible to specify precisely when and where a fluctuation will occur in the primordial vacuum, which will then grow into a universe. Within any finite interval of time, there is a positive probability of such a fluctuation occurring at any point in space. Thus, given infinite past time, universes will be eventually spawned at every point in the primordial vacuum. And as they expand, they will begin to collide with one another and coalesce with one another. Thus, given infinite past time, we should now be observing an infinitely old universe, not a relatively young one. Isham, who is probably Britain's leading quantum cosmologist, has called this problem, and I quote, fairly lethal to vacuum fluctuation models, and says that therefore they did not find wide acceptance. About the only way to avert the problem would be to postulate an expansion of the primordial vacuum itself. But then we're right back to the absolute origin implied by the standard model. According to Isham, these models were therefore jettisoned 20 years ago, and he says nothing much has been done with them since. This question, who created God, or all right, what is God's cause? I've heard so many college sophomores ask this question as though this is the sort of knockdown argument that destroys theism. And it's just based on a misunderstanding. Look at the first premise. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. That is to say, something cannot come into being out of nothing. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. But if something exists eternally, if it never comes into being, then it doesn't need a cause. And this is what the atheist has always said about the universe. This isn't special pleading for God. The atheist has typically said the universe is eternal and uncaused, and therefore there doesn't need to be anything beyond it. The problem is, philosophical argument and scientific evidence now make that improbable. So God, the answer is a timeless being beyond space and time, necessary in his existence, didn't have a beginning, and therefore is the first uncaused cause. So the question is really, what is the cause of the first uncaused cause? You know, which is sort of asking about the name of the married bachelor's wife. You know, it just is meaningless.